for the community of practice. We're gonna give folks a few more minutes to filter in. As you do, if you could please fill out this poll that Christina just put in the chat, we'll get to hear a little bit about what community development is looking like in your cities. Advance to that slide now. I'm really excited to see what everyone says to this question. What does your city commit to for equitable community development? Okay. Christina, should I let you pull up those responses or should I keep going?
You can keep going for now, and then I can pull them up once we have a few more answers.
Great. Okay. All right, so let's just dig in then, because we have a lot to cover today. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us for the Community of Practice. Today, we're going to discuss first, what can we do about green gentrification? And we'll get into that more soon. We're going to have 3 speakers, and one is Lauren Mullenbach, Sharka Volchnikova, and Maya Rogers. And then we will break for a discussion about the topic of green gentrification. And just to put things in context, last session, we explored how parks are a unique opportunity to build bridges across social divides, which many of you shared is a really important topic in your work right now. Across the country, we feel like polarization and segregation are getting worse and generally just feel like we could all be a little bit friendlier with one another. We heard from 2 speakers, Dr. Linda Trop from UMass Amherst and Daniel Valdez from Welcoming America, who showed how typical parks activities like playground builds or design charrettes can help reduce othering, increase trust, and form community relationships. Today, we are leveling up from relationships to community identity. When community members have a stronger social fabric based in community relationships, we start to see them unify around a shared common identity. Community identity. When we say community identity, we mean the ways in which people identify as members of a group based on shared geography, religion, trade, age, sexual orientation, and so on. Parks and public spaces play a critical role in shaping community identity. If communities have a space that they feel welcome in and reflects their values, they're more likely to care about their neighbors and where they're from, and this helps cut across social divides. We can harness community identity through the community engagement process in parks. Examples given on the slide on the left include representing community parks leadership and design, employing artists and cultural bearers, and culturally aware communications. Stronger community identity doesn't just improve parks, it can transform the community as a whole. In our next session on June 6th, we will talk about how community relationships and community identity lay the foundation for community power. So come back for that. We are in this, so for the second year of COP, we have been sharing some common opportunities and barriers across city parks experiences. And often one of the toughest topics is green gentrification. Today, we're going to focus on how investing in community identity is an effective way to resist trends of green gentrification. We'll explore the following key questions. What are the drivers of green gentrification? What does resistance to green gentrification look like? And how can parks departments be part of the solution and even part of the problem if we're not careful? We know how important this topic is and just how complicated it is, but we also want to acknowledge that TPL is not an expert in green gentrification. We're trying to figure it out through trial and error, just like you all. So for that reason, we're really excited today to hear from 3 leaders on this issue and to have an honest discussion as a group after. First up, I'd like to welcome Lauren Mullenbach to the stage. Dr. Lauren Mullenbach is an assistant professor in the Department of Geography and Environmental Sustainability at OU. She's a scholar of urban environmental justice focused on climate adaptation, green space development, gentrification, and well-being. Her current work focuses on equitable green space planning, city climate change planning, and homelessness. Lauren, we're really fortunate to have you here. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. Can you all hear me? Sometimes my microphone goes in and out.
Yeah, we hear you great.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much for inviting me to be here today. I want to reiterate what Geneva just said, that I don't even know if there is such a thing as an expert on green gentrification. It is such a complex issue, but I am here to give just a little bit of what I know and what I've learned from doing the research that I've done over the last several years. So I think you are in control of my slides, and I am realizing at this moment that I probably should not have had so many transitions in each of my slides because I'm not in control.
We're going to get through this together.
It'll be great. I promise they serve a purpose. Okay. So green gentrification is, I'm not sure it deserves its own separate term from gentrification, because green spaces that facilitate or are a part of the gentrification process, that's very typical. And so to me, green gentrification is like any other type of gentrification. So what is that? Well, this is pretty top of mind for me because I just spoke about this to my environmental justice course on Tuesday this week. And so this is something that I just gave a definition for to some undergrads. So I describe it as a process of neighborhood transformation. So you can put up my next bullets there. So neighborhood transformation, and I want to emphasize that this is a power-laden process, meaning that it's an influx of both capital and people into a neighborhood, but also an influx of people with power. And so this is a relatively violent process, and not necessarily in terms of physical violence, but more slow violence, which is what we call it in academia, because it is a situation where people who have less power, so generally poorer communities or communities of color, end up being displaced by this influx of capital and new people. And so what happens is generally wealthier, generally whiter people invest in a neighborhood for strategic purposes in order to gain profit. And so property values end up rising because of these investments, and that can manifest in a couple of different ways. If you are a renter, then that could mean that your rent rises very sharply in 1 to 2 years, forcing you to look elsewhere for a place to live. If you are a homeowner and your house gets appraised on an annual or very regular basis, that could mean you are suddenly given a property tax bill that you can't afford. And so this can result in a variety of things, like being physically displaced from your home, or if you can afford to stay in your home, then you at least experience a variety of cultural changes. New businesses suddenly appearing, suddenly there's new luxury housing towers surrounding what used to be your quiet neighborhood. It can look a lot of different ways in a lot of different cities. But the main takeaways is that there is large cultural changes and shifts, as well as property shifts. So business turnover and residential turnover. And the point of talking about this with this group of people is that this can occur through cleaning up of an environmental hazard or through creating an environmental amenity like a park. And so I have a few animations on this slide that we're going to flip to sort of, in a very cartoony way and very simplified way, show this process. So first you begin with an area of a city. If you advance to my next bullet, you start with an area that is, some people call it a park desert, or it's a park poor area, an area of a city where there's not a lot of green space, not a lot of vegetation. And for a great variety of reasons, cities invest in parks and green space in places like this. So maybe there's a new park. So if you advance to the next bullet, perhaps a new park is built in this particular place that is, again, traditionally a bit poorer, oftentimes a community of color. So then what happens, because this is, if it's a process of gentrification, property values will increase. So if you go to my next bullet, you'll see this can lead to housing value increases, which is nice if you own your home and you can afford the tax bill, but can be trouble if you are a renter and can no longer afford your rent. So then the next phase in this process, if you advance to the next bullet, is that people are often priced out or displaced. And again, that's displacement either physically because they can no longer afford to live in the place where they live, or culturally displaced because suddenly your neighbors are unfamiliar to you, or the businesses are also unfamiliar to you. And then a key point to finish out this little figure and this little animation is that what makes this particularly problematic is that the people who are priced out are often moving to another neighborhood that is just as sort of disinvested in as the one that they just left. So if you advance to the final animation, a lot of times people are moving to places that don't have the amenity that was just put in their neighborhood they were displaced from. So you continue to have this sort of inequitable access to parks and other green spaces. And so that's sort of bad news. So what do we do about it? And so there's a couple of things that I want to talk to you about today that we can do to sort of soften the blows of gentrification. So if you go to my next slide, I want to talk about first intentional design. And so the point I want to make on this slide is that there are a lot of actors involved in the process of gentrification. There's people who work for the city, there's developers, there's private partners, there's nonprofits, resident groups. There's a lot of people involved. And when gentrification is in part caused by, among other things, a new park or some other type of green space, sometimes people want to place the blame on the very visible new amenity, like the park. So they want to place the blame on the Parks Department or whoever it is that manages parks in the city. But I want to make clear that a park agency is oftentimes not the principal driver of gentrification. However, park agencies and parks departments can do a lot of things to sort of soften those blows of gentrification. So one is when a city or a park agency selects a design firm, you can work with the design firm to do what we call intentional design. And so what you see on this slide here is, this is the result of very intense sort of community engagement in the design, the physical layout of a new park. And so we see this park is in Chicago, and this happened about a decade ago, but it's a decent example of a park that was designed for the community's needs. And so the point that I want to make on this slide is that design firms and park agencies can avoid making certain assumptions about community needs. So avoid a sort of blanket or typical approach to park design, and instead maybe adopt the notion that there's a variety of ways that people can visualize and perceive an ideal park layout. So not everybody appreciates a completely sort of nature-based or highly vegetated park space. Some people want more playgrounds or plazas or gathering spaces. Some people want the really naturey sort of ornamental garden style parks. The point is that we should not be assuming that everyone has the same idea of how parks should be designed and what nature is to them. So how can you do this? There's a lot of academic minds out there that are working on the idea of community engagement, but some of the best examples that I've seen include hiring people from the community to actually be a part of the design process. So charrettes are great, knocking on doors is great, but also just hiring people to be a part of the process. And so the photo that you see on the right of the screen is that this very intentional design process resulted in a more lively park atmosphere. And so you can see people are actually appreciating that the park ended up being in their vision. And then on my final slide, which you can advance to, I want to tell, in the last couple of minutes that I have, I want to tell a really quick story about a place in Philadelphia that I view has been the best at community engagement that I have seen in my own research. Not that they are the best, period, but just the best that I have seen. So Bartram's Garden is located in southwestern Philadelphia. And Southwest Philadelphia is historically a very poor and predominantly Black area of the city. And Bartram's Garden was sort of ironically located there because it was historically a very ornamental, very historic garden that focused on being a botanical garden. And they had this reputation of being mostly serving sort of stuffy, older white residents who had to drive to Southwest Philly to appreciate Bartram's Garden, even though they were sort of embedded in this sort of poor community of color. And what they did about a dozen or so years ago is that they hired a new executive director, and her vision was that she wanted Bartram's Garden to be more a part of the surrounding community, that she didn't just want it to serve the sort of stuffy, older, white patrons that had historically gone to Bartram's Garden. And so if you advance to my next bullet, you'll see what they have done in terms of transforming what it is that they offer to the community. And so they have youth programs. They started an urban farm that grows food from the sort of African diaspora. They have a boating program. And so they've done a lot of really intentional engagement, and they've tried to rebrand themselves as Southwest Philly's backyard. And so that final little banner that was at the bottom of my final slide was just, that was a sticker that they made and passed around to people in that neighborhood to indicate, we are here for you. And so they have a community advisory board. They do all kinds of programming. So what they've done is, as gentrification has sort of creeped in and threatened Southwest Philadelphia, they've said, we know that you're experiencing these things and we only have so much power to help you deal with gentrification, but at the very least, we can give you a space that feels like yours. So as gentrification starts knocking on the door of Southwest Philly, they at the very least know that there is a park space in their area that is welcoming to them, that is catering to them instead of the gentrifiers, and that cares about their well-being and wants to provide things for them. And so I could probably talk about this for hours and hours and hours, but I'm going to stop there, and I'm happy to take any questions from anyone in the audience.
Thank you, Lauren. I could listen to you talk about this for hours and hours. We welcome anyone to ask questions for Lauren now in the chat. Meanwhile, I have a question for you, Lauren. So this is one of many academic papers you've written on the subject of green gentrification, and I think I would be really curious to know how you're measuring gentrification across your studies.
Yeah, that's a great question. The way that it's measured is probably one of the more heated debates in academia about gentrification. There are a lot of different indices out there that use a variety of secondary data like census demographics and income measurements and percent of the area that is homeowners versus renters. There's all kinds of things like that. And it truly, I hate to say this, but the way that you measure it depends on the city. And so I try and do a combination of qualitative methods like interview surveys alongside more secondary data to get more context. For instance, in a different part of Philadelphia, the gentrification is affecting Asian American residents and Asian immigrants, not necessarily some of the other demographics that we typically see with gentrification. It's also more of a mixed income area, but they're still sort of experiencing gentrification. And so if you just used the typical suite of things like an income threshold, certain demographic characteristics, certain education levels, then you would completely miss the fact that there is this transformation going on near Chinatown in Philadelphia. And so that's what I typically do, is because I don't do national scale studies. I typically do like individual case studies, but understanding more of the context before you sort of make any assumptions about what the gentrification looks like. I know that's not really a definition and a way to measure it across space, but that's unfortunately how we have to do it sometimes.
No, it's a really fair answer, and sounds very similar to what we talk about in this community of practice too, that you need the community wisdom and data-driven analysis. We're getting some really good questions in the chat. Dan, thank you for asking. Outside of programming, were there any physical alterations used to make the site more welcoming in the surrounding community of Bartram's Garden?
Yes, that's a great question. Yeah, so this sort of transformation was happening at the same time as they were expanding physically. So they acquired some adjacent land, and so they built a pavilion near the waterfront. They built a boating and fishing dock because there were a lot of sort of informal fishing that was happening in the community. There was like a cohort of older Black men who liked to come to the waterfront and fish together, and so they actually built them a pier. They built sort of a I don't think it was any more than a quarter or a half mile, but they have a little greenway now. So a paved trail for kids to bike to. What else was a part of this renovation? And then of course they built the urban farm, and they built a community garden with plots that are prioritized for residents of Southwest Philly. So they've done a lot of physical alterations as well as programming, and plus the addition of a community advisory board. It's, yeah, a full transformation.
That's great. We have time for one more question. Constance asked a really fantastic question. So it sounds like you're talking about one group overpowering another for profit. And do you see or have an example of how the outreach process supported the existing community to, quote, walk into their power? Erica's asking board makeup.
Board makeup, yeah. It oddly enough, there's a public housing project right next to Bartram's Garden. So half their community advisory board is people who live in public housing. So about walking into their power, that's real tricky. I don't know if I've seen an example of that specific thing. I see a lot of people doing things like hiring from the community, doing things like job training, like the DC Bridge Park that they're building near the Anacostia River. They're doing a lot of like providing people with jobs and stuff. I haven't checked in on that project in a while, but I know that was part of their plan, was to try and keep people in place and provide them with opportunities, both economic and social. I don't know whether or not it's worked, because again, I haven't really checked in a while, but yeah, the 11th Street Bridge Park. Yeah, they're sort of an interesting case to watch, because they're the first park that I've seen to create an equitable development plan. And a huge piece of that was like helping with rent control, building a certain percentage of affordable housing, hiring people from the area and things like that. They tried to hire a local design firm, things like that. But as for outreach being the only thing to help people sort of, I guess, get as much power as someone with capital, I don't know if outreach alone is gonna fix it, but good question.
Geneva, I'm not sure if you're
Dang it. Keeps
Oh,
happening.
no,
Sorry.
you're back. Now you're back. Mhm.
All right. I was just saying that we'll get to circle back to that question after our speakers who have a really related question to walking into power. So I'm pleased to introduce our next speaker, Sharka Volzhnikova. She is the director of the Bay Area Parks for People program at Trust for Public Land. She's a California registered landscape architect, professional leader, educator, and mentor. In the 2 decades of her career, she has left a mark of social and environmental justice and preservation of natural assets through design of public parks, elementary schools, college campuses, family and senior housing, and street improvements in the Bay Area. In her current role, she manages San Francisco's India Basin Signature Park, leads Bay Area's Green Schoolyards program, and her team manages multiple park and urban trail projects in San Francisco, Oakland, Richmond, and Hayward. Sharka, thank you for joining us. Let me pull up your slides.
Thank you, Geneva. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for having me on this panel and as part of the discussion. So I will be talking about the India Basin Waterfront Park project today, and hopefully I will touch on some of the questions that came up and have a chance to talk about the equity development plan that exists in conjunction with the design and construction of this particular park. So this park is in the southeast portion of San Francisco on the Bay side. It is the most ambitious park project for the city in terms of community engagement, involvement, and really drive, and also in terms of financial commitment. The park is being developed in equal partnership with the San Francisco Rec and Park, Trust for Public Land, the A. Philip Randolph Institute, and San Francisco Parks Alliance. It is 10 acres of recreational open space sort of embedded in a much larger 64-acre network of open space in that area that is being redone for the community. It is also connecting to a 500-mile long trail that's geared for pedestrians and bicycles along the entire bay. And it combines several properties to make the contiguous space. It is a San Francisco signature park project with emphasis on public access, recreation, resiliency, environmental justice, and social equity. And it really wouldn't be possible to develop without the community's initiative and participation. It was really proposed by and designed. Design input was given from and by the community. Next slide, please.
Hey, Sharka, sorry to interrupt. Could you speak up a little louder? I'm having some trouble hearing you.
Oh, I apologize. Let me see if I can do something about my voice here. Is this better?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you. If we can advance to the next slide. So why in this area? Why a signature park in this area, and why now? If you look at the map of San Francisco, San Francisco has actually achieved 100% in 10-minute walk to its parks, and we have 220 parks, over 6,000 acres of park space. But as you can also see, that the park space is not equally distributed within the city. And on the right side, you can see a map of the city with overlaid with mapping of neighborhoods that are poorer and where mostly communities of color live. The rectangles in the lower right-hand corner are of the Bayview, Hunters Point neighborhood and of the park itself. If we go to the next slide, I want to talk about the fact that the Bayview Hunters Point neighborhood is really laden by historic disadvantage and disinvestment, or it's not really even disinvestment. It's just that the area has never been invested in. It used to be a thriving economic power of San Francisco in the 1800s and into the I think 1940s with fishing industries and then boat and shipbuilding. But when the naval shipyard collapsed with it, collapsed the economic power of the neighborhood, and poverty seeped in, and with it problems that really blight poor communities, such as substance abuse and gang violence and things like that. The neighborhood is also really, really isolated from the rest of the city because of a couple of highways that cut it off. There are things like cement plant, waste facility, sewage treatment plant, decommissioned power plant around it, and the area is rather polluted and needs to grapple with that. The higher level or high levels of pollution of course have effect on the population's health. There's a high rate of asthma, heart attacks, and low weight of newborn babies. The area also is a home to 35,000 people, has really interesting topography, best microclimate in San Francisco, and is really nice and is really worth investing in. The population is diverse. There's approximately 40% of African-American people living there, 30% Hispanic population, and somewhere in the order of 20% Asian. As I mentioned before, poverty is high, and as well as unemployment. So next slide, please. The creation of the park really is predicamented by repair of trust in the neighborhood between the city and the community, and between players that have the power to improve the neighborhood. And you know, when we talk about why now, it's this process is so long-term. It is taking approximately a quarter of a century to get this off the ground. In 1999, the India Basin Neighborhood Association approached the city, Rec and Park, with a comprehensive plan for park improvement in the neighborhood. It was only 15 years later that the city actually acquired a piece of the land to make it possible. The park creation really needed to be tied into a very robust and extensive community engagement and the development or the creation of the equity development plan. So we had approximately 150 community events where the community was really invited to participate in design in the conversation. It became clear that the park design was really just one part of this effort, and that things like job creation were very high on the list of what the community needed. And so sort of folding this back into the equity development plan, and I will put a link into the chat for everyone to have access to it online. This started in 1919, was finished just last year, and it's really sort of establishing even national best practices for helping to eliminate racial inequalities. It's an effort to be at the forefront of unintended negative impacts that the park development may bring, including economic, physical, and cultural displacement. It is intended to build community resilience and capacity, and is integral to the park design. There's also, I want to touch on the sort of measuring of success. There is a tracking system being put in place that is being refined. And the EDP touches on several areas of the community, including arts, culture, and identity, workforce and business development, connectivity, transit, access and safety, healthy communities and ecology, youth opportunities, and housing security. And the engagement with the community is ongoing through these decades of involvement and will continue after the park is built. Part of it is, I know I'm running out of time, but I want to just briefly talk about a robust program of workforce development. People from the neighborhood, and especially young people, are invited to participate in job fairs and job preparedness training. They have an opportunity to get training with the contractor who is building the park and then be hired full-time by the contractor. We have had 3 graduates in the first cohort, the second has 14. So I would say that there's some measurable success there. The community also wanted to be able to get some empowerment, so financial literacy and training in fundraising within the community and with community members is part of the EDP. Clearly, prevention of displacement is also very important. So there's very robust advocacy for affordable housing in the neighborhood, support of workforce housing and housing co-ops, and support of home ownership, since this is not really a housing development project, but a park one, but all of this is baked into the equity development plan. And there's also a ton of cultural programming. Local artists were included in the design and in concepts for artwork that will be part of the park design. And there's programming for festivals and storytelling and mobile art exhibits and classes and so on and so forth. So it is really, really rich. I too could talk about this for a couple of hours, but I would now really like to invite Maya Rogers to speak and let her give you her own experience and perspective from this park development. Maya was born and raised in the Bayview Hunters Point neighborhood, and she has spearheaded the creation and revitalization of neighborhood parks. She holds a master's degree in social work from San Francisco State University and is currently the project manager for the Blue Greenway initiative that includes the India Basin Waterfront Park project. And Maya is a firm believer that parks and open spaces build community. She and I had the opportunity to collaborate on a hilltop park. I was working on that project as a designer, and it was her strength and vision and perseverance that really brought that project into existence. And it's nothing but admirable. So welcome, Maya.
Thank you so much, Sharka. I'd like to thank the folks at TPL just for inviting me, and also for, finding value in my experience and in my story. I'm Maya Rogers, the Senior Project Manager for the Blue Greenway Initiative, which includes the India Basin Waterfront Park Project. Next slide. That's not, well, yeah, we can go there. Here. I was born and raised, like Sharka said, in San Francisco's Baby Hunters Point neighborhood. A little bit about me, like who am I? My mother still lives there in our family home. And as an adult, I've lived in Bayview for 20 years. As a social worker, I worked with all of this community's most vulnerable populations, helping them find housing, helping them find jobs, helping them through, family issues. I'm a park lover and a fierce advocate for equity in the Bayview's parks, just given the history that the folks before me have talked about. My most challenging and rewarding job is that I'm a mom to a teenager in this community. This is us at my niece's graduation last year. Next slides. So how did all this begin? At home with my maybe 15-month old. And I wanted to walk her to the park nearest to our apartment, which was on top of the hill in Baby Hunters Point. Much to my surprise, the park that I remembered playing in as a young person was empty. It was empty kind of in all the ways, right? There were no people, and there was a sandlot where the play structure was previously. The sundial was still there, but that was it. The skateboard was exactly as it was from its construction in 1978. So I did a quick search, found Jake Gilchrist, who was then managing what was called the Community Opportunity Fund, which today is called the CCG. It's the Community Challenge Grant. Jake said he had just talked to another resident who in turn was Jaffria Morris. Jaffria and I connected with Chablis Scott and Lena Miller, who met. Then we had a site visit with Jake, right? And Jake said, this project is too big for a COF, which I'm sure folks have heard before, a project that needs so much work that it's too big for the local smaller pots of money. We reached out to the Trust for Public Land and began this partnership with Trust for Public Land and SF Record Park. Fund development, talking to donors, really working to generate energy around this project. The more we talked, the more we realized that this was not just a playground project. This was going to be a full renovation of this space. Sharka and I met when she was at Miller and Company, and they were the landscape architects on the project. We began having meetings, many community meetings. I actually don't know how many, but a very deep community process. We wanted the community to have ownership of this space and feel like it was developed for them. And we had meetings about playground elements, art, benches, the material of the benches, I vividly remember a conversation. We met with youth about the playground elements and walked in feeling really good about the design. And the kids said, "Where are the slides?" So we, actually generally went back to the drawing board and put in, not slides, sorry, where are the swings? And they also were insistent that the concrete slides had to stay. Through this, the learnings from this were that kind of reaffirmed that the community members are the experts. Yes, we know a lot of things about community development and capital projects and landscape architecture and construction. But the folks that live there know what they want. They know what they can gather around. They know the needs of their own communities. And we pay people for their time. We realize that folks are taking time from their families, sometimes work, to help us make these decisions for our own work. So we really had to honor that. Next slide. That's a few more. Okay, this skate park is heavily used these days, but this was just a bowl before this project. We worked with DLX Skate Shop to gather the skater community around this project. Many of the OG skaters remember the old skate bowl and looked forward to a more modern setup. Next slide. This lawn was a specific thing. Initially we thought maybe we could keep it, but we realized there was no line of sight into the park from the street, which was a huge safety issue in our community. Now you can see completely into the lawn. There's line of sight directly in all the way to the edge. Next slide. This seat, the mosaic seating, we work with youth from the adjacent KIPP High School to design and create the mosaics on this seat. You can't see it, but on the street facing side, the western edge of that seat, there are more mosaics that each student individually made. Next slide. So the element we knew we had to get right was the playground. We knew the community wanted to serve multiple ages, different kind of multi-generational families. And we heard loud and clear it had to have swings, like I said, and we should keep the iconic San Francisco concrete slides. Hilltop Park was the first park that I had ever worked on in this capacity. I went on to advocate for the renovation of Casey Jones Park, Gilman Park, and now working on the India Basin Waterfront Park project and the activations. Next slide. Sharka talked a lot about the India Basin Waterfront Parks project, the partnership between SF Parks Alliance, the Trust for Public Land, SF Rec and Park Department, and the A. Philip Randolph Institute as our community partner. I've included some renderings here of what 900 Ennis phases 1 and 2 of the project will look like upon completion. We're doing what's called interim activation at India Basin Shoreline Park, which is adjacent, which is phase 3 of the project. These activations are split into 3 categories: on-site, connector, and satellite activations. Next slide. These activations pilot activities and programming in order to identify elements that are received well and programming that could use improvement. Programming that will likely be carried over to the new park. Next slide. We gather data from attendees, vendors, community partners, other participants. We want to know what their experience was and how it could be improved, if at all. The satellite activations are a way, if we go back to the community as experts, to acknowledge other community groups and orgs, basically saying we're not competing. We want to support your work. That sentiment is reflected all throughout the Equitable Development Plan. Next slide. India Basin Waterfront Park Equitable Development Plan. The physical space and the equitable development plan go hand in hand. The Equitable Development Plan, which we call the EDP for this project, was developed by the leadership committee comprised of all community members. The 6 areas of focus hone in on areas that can mitigate the long-term negative effects that developments cause. The arts and culture area focuses on preserving the history of the Black culture in Bayview Hunters Point. This cultural preservation can prevent the erasure of the many years of hard work and advocacy that had created this present opportunity. Youth opportunities, the committee really wanted the youth and young adults to have opportunity to both work and play here. Contrary to popular belief, personally, I believe that all youth in every area are kind of our at-risk population. The things that they're the most impacted by negative effects in communities, especially communities with these demographics. Housing security, transportation, which is a huge issue. Going back to what Sharka was saying about how this community and many communities like this are cut off by freeways and highways. Workforce development and healthy communities and ecology. We've begun the implementation of this plan already through workforce development programs, spearheaded by our partner at the A. Philip Randolph Institute. On the activation side, every event, program, and idea has the arts, culture, and identity thread throughout. We want folks to feel ownership and feel seen. I think I'm gonna stop there. Thank you for listening. Next slide. My information's on the last slide here if you wanna reach out.
Thank you so much, Maya. I could ask the other speakers to join us on screen. We have a few minutes for Q&A. I think maybe 1 or 2 questions. And I definitely would like to give Maya a question. If we could hear from you, we heard this story from you about how your daughter you worried that your daughter would be too old to play in the park that you started building when she was 15 months. And now you're moving on to another really long-term project. So I'd love to hear from you, Sharka, and Lauren, if you've seen anything in the field, how to ensure people are engaged in really long projects like this and feel like they're a part of the process.
I think for us, what we found is that people want to be involved in different parts of the project. There are some people who want to know everything you do along the way. Transparency is a huge issue, right? And so, like for India Basin, we have a newsletter that goes out and it has like project updates and like things that are happening on the project. For Hilltop, it was kind of through the community meeting process. It was asking people for feedback. I think that was something we learned though, is that people want to know more. I think sometimes we feel like it's like people aren't interested in the small details, but I think communities really do want to know the small details.
And if I can add to it, it's really, really important to make community meetings and workshops accessible to everybody in the neighborhood. So scheduling meetings at the time that people can attend is extremely, extremely important. Potentially providing childcare stipends so that people can participate and don't have to lose income. Food if the meetings are happening during dinner time, and things like that. And it really is also important to, as Maya emphasized, engage youth. And what we're experiencing here with India Basin is that young people are super interested in getting training and bringing and going on to getting higher education and then bringing that knowledge back into the community. So one example is we have youth, a young man who went from the A. Philip Randolph Institute, got an internship with CCS, fundraising management firm, and then got hired by them, and they are providing, they're donating their time one-to-one for their project, and he's getting training in financial resilience, and is really interested in bringing back to the neighborhood later on. There's a program for horticulture trainings through the Rec and Park department where people will get training and then will be able and will be hired by the Rec and Park department to maintain parks and maintain particularly India Basin. So there, you know, the continuity of the involvement is really crucial.
That's awesome, Sharka. Anything you wanted to add to that, Lauren, about how to keep communities involved over a long period of time?
Yeah, I think the easiest way is probably to give someone a role to play. Like if they have some, even a teeny tiny amount of responsibility, they're more likely to stay engaged if they're responsible for some aspect of programming, of planning, of watering trees, whatever it is. So like volunteer groups are a great way to have long-term engagement. You know, if you have to show up every or one Saturday a month for 2 hours to do X, Y, or Z thing, you're more likely to stick around for a long time. But also a huge piece of it is staying in place and not having to move away, as we've talked about with gentrification. So if you can afford to live in the place for a long period of time, that's a huge help. And so there's not much you can do about that if someone's forced to move away. But if the community is relatively stable over time, then inviting someone to be a part of it and have a role to play, I think is an easy way to go.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so sense of ownership, ensuring that sense of ownership over the space over a period of time. Thank you so much. I am going to pass things off to Christina to share the poll results, and then we're going to break for breakouts. But first off, I want to thank Maya, Sharka, and Lauren for joining us. It's been really, really interesting and insightful. Thank you.
Thank you. It was great.
Great. So I know we will transition to breakout rooms soon, but before we go into these conversations, just wanted to show these poll results of within your own context, what does your city commit to prioritizing? We are seeing higher responses among youth opportunities as well as connectivity to these parks. And then after that, around public health, community health improvements, local arts and culture. And then for those, if you feel compelled to share what is within the category of other, please go ahead so we can capture that in the Zoom chat. And then with that, Geneva, I will just hand it back off to you.
Thanks, Christina. So we have a couple exciting engagements coming up after this. We are hosting a park bench chat, which if you haven't heard of those before, it's a series by the Trust for Public Lands where we invite speakers to talk about just really interesting stuff related to parks. And so this next one is going to be moderated by our director, Terry Simmons, who you've seen on this series before, and he will be joined by 3 community organizers and community leaders to talk about heroism starting at home. And it's really very strongly related to what we've been talking about today, and we're going to hear some more community stories there. And there will be a really exciting announcement from us, and I am not going to spoil it, so you should just join. But the next community of practice session is June 6th, and we'll be talking about community power and how once you've built a stronger community identity through community engagement, building out more capacity. And then our last session for the COP will be July 13th. So please join for that as well. And then we have breakout groups where we'll discuss what are you hearing around this topic of green gentrification, and how are you partnering to prevent inequitable community development, and lastly, some strategies for sustaining resident engagement. So we can go ahead and do breakouts now. Thanks.